Good morning, students. How are you? I hope you all are fit and fine. And in today's video, we will start the chapter number 2, The Portrait of a Lady. Okay, this is a very beautiful chapter written by Khushwant Singh. And in this chapter, Khushwant Singh begins with the real life account how his relationship was with his grandmother, and in this chapter he described the situation when he was in a village, and what are the changes begins when his parents settled down in his city and they called him. Okay, so first of all, The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Before starting the chapter, I want to introduce the writer, author of this chapter, Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh, born on 2 February 1915 and died on 20 March 2014, is an Indian author, lawyer, diplomat, journalist, and a politician. His experience in 1947 partition of India inspired him to write Train to Pakistan in 1956, which became his most well-known novel. He has won Padam Bhushan, Padam Vibhushan, and Punjab Ratna award. So this is the small description of the writer Khushwant Singh. Now chapter begins. This is the first paragraph of our chapter. So students, in this first paragraph, the writer is describing the setting of a drawing room. Okay, he is describing about the portrait of his grandfather, which is hung above the mantelpiece. Mantelpiece means अंगीठी. अंगीठी जो हम हमारे घर में रखते हैं, वैसे ही राइटर के घर में एक अंगीठी थी, एक मेंटल पीस था. उसके जस्ट अबाव उनके दादाजी की एक पोर्ट्रेट लगी हुई थी. ओके, सो लेट्स स्टार्ट द चैप्टर. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. So, the writer is saying that my grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, everybody have a grandmother, was an old woman. Okay, she had been old and wrinkled. So, this is the description of her appearance. She had been old. She is getting very old, and her face is wrinkled. And for the last 20 years, okay, that I had known her. So writer is saying that from the last 20 years I have been seeing that my grandmother is very old and she has been wrinkled face. People said that she had been once young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. So writer is saying that people said that she had once been young and pretty. Okay, so in this chapter, in these lines, the writer is describing and imagining that my grandmother, now he is very old, but people say that once upon a time she was a very young and pretty, but this thing is very hard to believe. And they also say that she had a husband. So now she is very old and wrinkled faced, and when he imagined about her grandmother that she was very young and pretty, this thing is very hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. So the portrait of his grandfather is above the mantelpiece in drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose fitting clothes. So this is the appearance of his clothes: a big turban on a head and loose fitting clothes like old Punjabi man. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest. Okay, so he has a long white beard, means दाढ़ी. उनकी दाढ़ी बहुत बड़ी थी जो कि चेस्ट तक नीचे तक आ रही थी. And he looked at least 100 years old, and he looked very old. Okay, when we look at the portrait of his grandfather, he did not look the sort of a person who would have a wife or a children. He looked as if he could only lots and lots of grandchildren. So students, in this picture he is looking so old that if anybody could see the picture, they thought that he did not look like the sort of the person who had children. Apart from that, he's like a he's like a that kind of person who have a grandchildren. Okay, it means he's looking very old. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost rewarding. So these are the two contrary pictures. Okay, first of all, the grandmother, and the grandmother was very young and pretty in his young days, but the grandfather, he is very old and looking that he had a very grandchildren. She often told us the games she used to play as a child that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. So, students, in these lines, the writer describes that when the grandmother told us the games about she used to play in her childhood, then writer began that these games are undignified. They are not equally status according to the writer, and he thought that these games are just like a fables means कथाएं, लोक कथाएं, जो कि प्रॉफिट्स, जो पैगंबर या साधु या कोई बड़े लोग उनको सुनाते थे. तो उसको ऐसा लगता था कि ये जो ग्रैंड मदर जो हमें गेम बता रही है ये हमारे लायक नहीं है, ये बिल्कुल उन कहानियों में किस्सों में सुनाए जाने वाले गेम्स की तरह थे. मतलब दादी माँ के गेम्स और राइटर के गेम्स में काफ़ी अंतर था. अब आगे आता है नेक्स्ट पैराग्राफ में. शी हैड ऑलवेज बीन शॉर्ट and fat and slightly bent. So this is the appearance of her grandmother. She was very short, fat but slightly bent, झुकी हुई थी. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. So crisscross means the lines which cross one another. Okay, so this is the face of her, the description of her face. Now we were certain she had always been as we had known her, and writer was very firm and determined that my grandmother is looking like as just she is, and she is equally just like as we seen her. Old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and stayed at the same age for 20 years, and she is getting so old that after the writer is imagine that after 20 years she can't grow more. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless with white with one hand and resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. So this is the description that she hobbled, लड़खड़ाते हुए चलना, और पूरे सफ़ेद बाल थे उनके, एक हाथ उनके कमर पे रहता था और एक हाथ में उनके माला रहती थी. ठीक है, और पूरे घर के अंदर चलती रहती थी और बिल्कुल सफ़ेद बाल थे और झुकी हुई थी, और इस तरीके का उनका डिस्क्रिप्शन बताया जा रहा है. हर सिल्वर लॉक्स वर स्कैटर्ड अनटाइडली ओवर हर पेल पकर्ड फेस and her lips constantly moved in an audible flavor. Sir, her silver locks, it means her white hairs, scattered over her yellowish face, yellow puckered face, मुरझाया हुआ चेहरा, झुका हुआ. Yes, she was beautiful, but writer is saying that she was very beautiful. She was like a winter landscape in the mountain. She is describing her beauty with the winter landscape in the mountains. An expanse of white, pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. And her grandmother was just like a peace and contentment. If you see the writer's grandmother, you feel peace and contentment. It means satisfied, satisfaction. Okay.